A small chartered plane carrying 9 people has crashed in Thailand. The plane had just taken off from Bangkok for a short flight to a resort in eastern Trot province when it lost contact with ground control 11 minutes later. Local authorities say all those on board died in the Thursday afternoon crash, including 5 tourists from China and 4 Thai nationals. Investigators are still looking into the cause of the accident.
Profit over safety. The dark secrets behind Flight 269. On the 16th of September 2007, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, Flight 269, has been making headlines for all the wrong reasons, and today, we're going to explore the controversy surrounding this airline and the worrying trend of prioritizing profits over passenger safety. Flying for Thai budget, airline 12Go crashed while attempting to land on the resort island of Phuket. As the plane approached the runway during a powerful thunderstorm, wind shear forced the pilots to abandon the approach. But during the attempt to climb out, the plane lost altitude and smashed into an embankment alongside the runway, tearing the airplane apart and killing 90 of the 130 passengers and crew. Flight 269 has been making headlines for all the wrong reasons, and today we're going to explore the controversy surrounding this airline and the worrying trend of prioritizing profits over passenger safety. All right, 12Go Airlines Flight 269 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Bangkok to Phuket, Thailand. On 16 September 2007, about 15:41 ICT, the McDonnell Douglas MD-82 operating the flight crashed into an embankment beside runway 27 at Phuket International Airport, bursting into flames upon impact during an attempted go-around after an aborted landing, killing 90 of the 130 people on board. It is the 3rd deadliest aviation incident to occur in Thailand. There are several red flags surrounding Flight 269 that have raised eyebrows in the aviation industry. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 with line number 1129 and manufacturer's serial number 49183, made its first flight on November 13, 1983, later delivered on July 4, 2003, 20 December 1983, and first operated by Trans World Airlines as N912TW, later transferred to American Airlines as part of the merger between the two airlines before being acquired by the airline in February 2007, 7 months before the crash, and registered as HSOMG. On the 16th of September 2007, wind shear seemed to be the most likely cause of the crash, which took the lives of tourists and crew members from at least 13 countries. But it soon became apparent that the sequence of events was rooted in the way the pilots executed the go-around. Their tragic errors during the maneuver led investigators to a series of disturbing revelations about 12Go and its parent company, Orient Thai, including that airline officials had been lying to the investigation committee to throw them off track. It was on the 16th of September 2007 that 123 passengers and 7 crew boarded 12Go Flight 269 for a regular flight from Bangkok to Phuket. In command of the McDonnell Douglas MD-82 that afternoon was Captain Arif Mulyadi, an experienced Indonesian pilot with over 16,000 flight hours. Joining him in the cockpit was First Officer Montri Kamal Ratanachai, a Thai national who had been trained from scratch through Orient Thai's in-house training program and had since accumulated a little over 1,400 flight hours. The weather conditions over Phuket that day were quite stormy, with reports of lightning, rain, and shifting winds. By the time Flight 269 began its descent toward the airport, other airplanes had already reported significant airspeed fluctuations on approach. Despite the difficult conditions, however, First Officer Kamal Ratanachai was at the controls, rather than the much more experienced Captain Mulyadi, who was working the radios. As Flight 269 descended into Phuket, Kamal Ratanachai had a lot on his plate. The approach to Phuket's runway 27 was complicated by a 1.4-degree offset to ensure terrain clearance, meaning that the instrument landing system would guide them in on a heading not quite aligned with the runway, and they would need to manually line up after making visual contact with the runway environment. To get ready for this turn, and to combat shifting winds more easily, Kamal Ratanachai disconnected the autopilot at 1,500 feet. But the weather conditions were rapidly deteriorating. At 3:37 p.m., as Flight 269 was descending through 1,400 feet, the tower controller reported a wind reading of 240 degrees at 15 knots and cleared them to land. But just 1 minute later, the tower reported that the wind speed had doubled to 30 knots as a powerful thunderstorm rolled over the airport. Heavy rain began to fall and visibility plummeted. Wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed and direction began to cause major fluctuations in their airspeed. Nevertheless, the runway was in sight, so they pressed onward. At 3:39, the tower called them again to inform that wind over the runway had increased to a blistering 40 knots. Moments later, as they passed through 200 feet, the plane's rate of descent increased to over 1,800 feet per minute, more than twice the normal rate on landing, possibly due to a downdraft associated with the thunderstorm. The plane began to fall below the glide slope, recognizing that they were seconds away from slamming hard into the runway. It was in these few critical seconds that First Officer Kamal Ratanachai made a fatal error. However, if the plane is configured for landing with the flaps extended and the landing gear down, and the height of the plane drops below 50 feet, the auto throttle enters retard mode, in which it decreases engine power to idle in preparation for touchdown. When Flight 269 descended below 50 feet above ground level in the moments before First Officer Kamal Ratanachai called for a go-around, the problem was that moving the throttles does not cancel retard mode. Alternatively, the pilot can turn off the auto throttle entirely by pressing the auto throttle disconnect buttons on the sides of the throttle levers, allowing power to be added manually. In short, it should have been trivial to take the auto throttle out of retard mode, but in the heat of the moment, First Officer Kamal Ratanachai simply forgot to do either of these things. By pushing the throttles to toga power without pressing the go-around switches, Kamal Ratanachai failed to cancel retard mode. Just a couple seconds after calling for the go-around, he took his hand off the throttle levers, and the auto throttle began reducing thrust back to idle again. At that moment, still unaware of what the auto throttle was doing, Kamal Ratanachai made a surprise decision to relinquish control of the airplane. "Flaps 15, your control," he said to Captain Mulyadi. Mulyadi could not have expected that he would be called upon to fly the plane while in the middle of executing a go-around, but he dutifully took over control, holding onto the yoke to guide the plane up and away from the airport. "Set my heading," he said, instructing Kamal Ratanachai to enter a target, heading to fly back to the beginning of the approach. "Landing gear." A warning began to call out, "Landing gear, landing gear," as the aircraft systems still believed they were trying to land. By now, engine power had reduced all the way to idle, and they began to lose speed. Their altitude peaked at 300 feet, and the plane started to descend. Upon hearing "pull up," Captain Mulyadi jammed the throttles to toga power and pulled back to climb, but it was far too late. 2 seconds later, Flight 269 struck the ground just to the right of runway 27. Inside the plane, most of the passengers had survived the impact, including both pilots. But the severe damage to the airplane caused the emergency lighting to fail, and passengers were forced to grope their way toward the exits amid pitch darkness, choking smoke, and scorching fire. Most of those who managed to escape did so through the left overwing exit, while those who were unable to get out in time collapsed from toxic gases or perished in the flames. Fire trucks rushing to respond to the disaster found that there was a deep ditch in between the runway and the airplane that prevented them from getting close to the seat of the fire, and they were forced to spray water over the ditch and onto the plane from a considerable distance. Meanwhile, those who escaped the plane found that only one ambulance with a single medical crew had responded to the crash, which was woefully insufficient to deal with the dozens of injured passengers streaming from the shattered fuselage. By the time fire crews had extracted everyone from the airplane, 90 people were dead, including Captain Mulyadi and First Officer Kamal Ratanachai, who, like many of their passengers, survived the impact only to die in the fire. Among the dead were citizens of 13 countries, including dozens of Thais, 8 Israelis, 8 Britons, and 5 Americans. 40 people survived, over half of whom suffered serious injuries, some of them significantly exacerbated by the delay in medical care caused by the lack of ambulances. It would soon be discovered that the poor emergency response to the crash stemmed from the fact that Phuket Airport had not created an emergency plan for what to do in the event of an accident. In the absence of a coordinated plan that all involved parties could practice something which was required by regulations, word was slow to get out, and when it did, various agencies and organizations all attempted to assist in an uncoordinated manner that prolonged the rescue operation. Meanwhile, Thailand's Aircraft Accident Investigation Committee, with the assistance of the US National Transportation Safety Board and Boeing, set about finding the cause of the crash. Initially, the high number of reports of wind shear by planes that landed just before Flight 269 suggested that a sudden downdraft, such as a microburst, could have been the reason why it lost altitude during the go-around. But a more detailed analysis of the weather and the flight data showed that the sequence of events was completely contained within the cockpit. During the approach, something probably wind shear forced the plane below the glide path to the runway, prompting the first officer to call for a go-around. But neither pilot ever pressed the toga switches, causing the auto throttle to remain in retard mode, where it attempted to reduce thrust to idle in preparation for touchdown. Neither pilot noticed that the auto throttle had reduced engine thrust until after the plane began to lose altitude, by which point it was too late to prevent the crash. The central area of inquiry therefore became the pilots themselves. What were their histories? Were they fatigued? How had they been trained? The AAIC had to acquire this information from 1-2-Go itself, and it was at this point that things started to get messy. Investigators wanted to look at the pilots' recent schedules to determine whether they had been overworked, so 1-2-Go provided them with documents listing all the flights completed by Captain Arif Mulyadi and First Officer Montri Kamalratanachai during the 3 months before the crash. Everything seemed to follow duty time regulations, seemingly ruling out fatigue as a cause of the accident. But the problems didn't end with the maintenance and management. The quality of the pilots themselves was reportedly quite poor. Experienced pilots from other parts of the world, many of whom turned to 1-2-Go for employment after being laid off during the post-9/11 aviation downturn, had few positive things to say about those newer pilots who were trained internally by the airline. The AAIC found that the training was indeed of very poor quality. Captain Mulyadi hadn't received training in crew resource management, the most critical tool to prevent pilot error since 2001, and First Officer Kamalratanachai hadn't received any CRM training at all. Other training violations discovered by the AAIC included the use of simulators which weren't equipped with wind shear alerting systems or ground proximity warning systems, numerous skipped items during proficiency checks, incomplete training on control handovers, and the complete absence of any sort of training for flight dispatchers. These deficiencies had led to several close calls, including a 2004 incident in which an Orient Thai jumbo jet came within 200 meters of striking the Tokyo Tower after the pilot strayed off course while on approach to Haneda Airport. Still, that was not all. Even in an environment where many pilots had been brought up through this lackluster training system, multiple former pilots reported that Captain Arif Mulyadi was especially frustrating to work with. It was an open secret at 1-2-Go that Mulyadi tended to completely freeze up when faced with difficult approaches or adverse weather. One former first officer said to Channel 9, in heavily stilted English, "2 pilots at the time did advise me before I started to fly with Captain Arif. It was very short. He just says, 'Well, you are going to fly alone.'" Another former pilot said that he once flew with Mulyadi into Kabul on a charter flight to pick up Afghan President Hamid Karzai. And during the difficult approach into Kabul, Mulyadi froze up and was unable to make any decisions or control the airplane in any way. For the return flight with Karzai on board, Mulyadi was relieved of command. After reviewing the evidence, both the AAIC and Channel 9 came to agree that 12Go and its parent company Orient Thai had created a culture in which safety was willfully disregarded. The AAIC refrained from forceful language, but noted that the company was full of employees from numerous countries who spoke different languages and had different concepts of safety, and no effort had been made to foster a unified approach to regulatory compliance. Channel 9 simply let those who had seen the airline from the inside speak their mind. They're one of the lowest standards of an airline within Asia. I would make the comparison to aviation in Africa, said one former pilot. I wouldn't fly it if you paid me to, said another. The consensus seemed to be that things became markedly worse after the 2004 tsunami, when financial problems caused the airline's management to start finding creative ways to reduce expenses. With all this additional information, it was possible to explain why the pilots of Flight 269 failed to properly execute the go-around. They had been overworked without enough rest for months and were not at the top of their game. First Officer Kamal Ratanachai, despite having fewer hours than a first officer in the United States would have on day one of the job, ended up flying the approach despite the bad weather and other aggravating circumstances, something which former 12Go pilots felt was irresponsible. Possibly, Captain Mulyadi did not want to fly the approach because he was incapable of handling adverse circumstances. During the flight, very few words were exchanged between the pilots. As he struggled to bring the plane in against a 40-knot headwind, rain and wind shear on an offset ILS approach, First Officer Kamal Ratanachai's stress levels would have been significantly elevated. Add on to that his chronic fatigue combined with that mid-afternoon lull in the body's circadian rhythm, and it didn't take much to send the whole house of cards crashing down. It was at this moment that he finally decided that he had reached the limit of his abilities and could take it no longer. He handed over control to Captain Mulyadi at the worst possible time, in the middle of a complex maneuver with virtually no warning. Mulyadi, who was also fatigued, would have had just seconds to intuit what the airplane was doing. This task apparently required the use of both hands. At the same time, Kamal Ratanachai, having given up control, also stopped guarding the throttles. Before either pilot could figure out what was going on, the autothrottle rolled the engines back to idle, the plane lost speed, and they fell out of the sky. In April 2009, 12Go Airlines was added to the EU blacklist. It was removed shortly thereafter. In September 2010, the 12Go brand was dropped and the airline was merged with Orient Thai Airlines. The crash report was published by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Committee of the Ministry of Transport. A separate 2-year report done by the United States National Transportation Safety Board was incorporated into the AAIC report. Both reports found that the captain and first officer had worked hours more than the legal flight limits, that the first officer attempted to transfer control to the captain during the go-around, that neither pilot initiated a go-around, and that the training and safety programs at the airline were deficient. Between 2009 and 2010, 12Go Airlines was prohibited from operating in European Union nations due to safety concerns. At the time of the accident, the airline was owned by Orient Thai Airlines, and in July 2010, it fully rebranded as Orient Thai Airlines. The crash of 12Go Flight 269 could be described as a wake-up call for Thailand's aviation authorities. Prior to this accident, Thailand had experienced a major crash every few years. Now, almost 21 years later, there has yet to be another major accident in Thailand or involving a Thai carrier. No longer do aviation experts have any reason to mention Thailand in the same breath as Indonesia, which continues to suffer a major crash approximately every 2 years. But more could have been done despite the pleas of the crash survivors and the relatives of those who died. Udom Tantiprasang Chai, friend of the former Thai king and leader of what many feel was a criminal enterprise, passed away in January 2021 without ever being brought to justice. The story of Flight 269 is a sobering reminder of what can happen when profit is put over safety. It's a wake-up call for all of us to demand better from the airlines and to hold them accountable for their actions. So, what do you think? Do you think airlines should be held to a higher safety standard, or are cost-cutting measures just a part of the business? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about airline safety practices, be sure to check out my other video on the topic. Turn on the notification bell icon and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.